Welcome to another edition of Life, Love, and Philosophy. This is the seventh in a series of programs I'm doing on morality and what famous thinkers in philosophy, psychology, literature, and religion have said about it. I've been addressing the question, what should be our guide in determining what is moral? In previous programs, I've discussed in some detail the possibility of using one's conscience as a guide, or a holy book, or one's reason, one's intellect, or the law. I've attempted to show that while each of them can be valuable, none of them is a perfect guide to morality. People have done great evil using each of them as a guide. In my last program, I initiated a discussion of the possibility of using the law as a guide to morality by introducing some comments from the very famous French intellectual Montaigne, who himself was a lawyer. And here are Montaigne's words, pretty powerful, I think, on the possibility of using the law as a guide to morality. Again, I'm quoting him. The laws maintain their credit, not because they are just, but because they are laws. The laws are often made by fools, and even more often made by men who have a hatred of equality. The laws are always made by men, and men are vain and unstable creatures. He went on to say this, and again I'm continuing to quote him. There is nothing so grossly and ordinarily faulty as the laws. Whoever obeys them because they are just is not, as he should be, obeying them for a just reason. Pretty powerful words. Well, what might be some historical examples of what Montaigne is talking about? Because his main point is that the laws are often unfair, unjust, immoral. Well, if we look at American history, perhaps the outstanding example of immorality in the law is the original U.S. Constitution. The original U.S. Constitution, as written in the 1780s, made slavery legal. That's right. Our original Constitution made slavery legal. Indeed, as I pointed out some weeks before, a very famous Supreme Court case entitled the Dred Scott decision, or usually referred to as the Dred Scott decision, focused the country's attention on how legal slavery was. Dred Scott was a slave whose owner, and this of course took place before the Civil War, whose owner took him to a free area of the United States, meaning an area where there wasn't slavery. Well, Dred Scott sued in court. He claimed that since he was now living in a free area of the United States, he should no longer be a slave. The decision eventually reached the Supreme Court, the highest court, of course, in the United States. And what did the Supreme Court decide? Well, firstly, the Supreme Court decided that Dred Scott as a slave was not a citizen of the United States, and therefore did not even have any right to sue in court. And secondly, and this was the most significant part of the decision, the Supreme Court said that Dred Scott had no right to be free, even though he was living in a free area of the United States, because according to the U.S. Constitution, the fundamental law of the land, he was property. He was property. And therefore, just as you can bring a chair anywhere you want in this country, and the chair is still yours, so too at that time, the Supreme Court decided that if a slave owner brought a slave into any area of the United States, whether it was a free state or a slave state, was irrelevant. that slave still was property and belonged to the owner. And again, what made this decision possible was the fact that our original U.S. Constitution made slavery legal. It wasn't until after the Civil War, approximately 80 years after our Constitution went into effect, that the Constitution was amended to abolish slavery. I mentioned last week some other examples, historical examples of unfair laws. I talked about Hitler's Germany and the Nuremberg laws of 1935. These were anti-Semitic laws. These laws, for example, stripped German Jews of their citizenship, so that as a consequence of this law, a Jew could no longer be a citizen of Germany, and those who had been citizens were no longer considered citizens. The Nuremberg laws also banned Jews from certain occupations. For example, teaching, writing, giving concerts. Another kind of law that has been commonplace, rather commonplace in many countries over the centuries, is a law the Soviet Union used to have and China still has. It's a law which provides for censorship of the media. It's a law which dictates that the government will supervise what newspapers, radio stations, television stations are allowed to report. Indeed, we know that in China today, the government also makes a serious effort to censor the internet. And China, by the way, is not alone, by no means, is not alone in its effort to censor the media. There are many countries in the world which have laws which continue to allow the government to do this. And of course, if we're talking about unjust laws, it's true that virtually every country in the world at one time or another, indeed some today, have laws discriminating against women. They've been very common. For example, in the United States, the law did not permit women to vote until 1920, just as our original Constitution regarded slaves as property. Our original Constitution did not give the vote to women, and it wasn't until about 150 years, approximately 150 years, after our Constitution went into effect, that it was changed, amended, to give women the right to vote. Women in America also suffered other legal disabilities. In the early years of our country, for example, women were not allowed to own property. And in divorce cases, men had many more rights. The husband had many more rights than the woman, again, where a divorce was pending. An outstanding example, glaring example today of a law that discriminates against women, and I mentioned there are so many of them throughout the world, would be a law in Saudi Arabia, which today prevents women in Saudi Arabia from driving automobiles. And another example of an unjust law. Today, the country of Turkey has a law which makes it illegal to insult Turkishness. Again, it's illegal in Turkey today to insult Turkishness. As a consequence of this law, Orhan Pamuk, Turkey's most famous contemporary writer, winner of the Nobel Prize in 2006, was prosecuted under this law within the last 2 years because he refused to obey Turkey's taboo against anyone discussing the alleged genocide of Armenians in Turkey during World War I. Pomek, again, this Nobel Prize winner, argued that people should be able to talk about and write about this genocide, which virtually all historians, if not all reputable historians, claim did take place. It was a genocide in which the Turkish government annihilated, killed approximately 1 million Armenians living in Turkey. Going back further in history to look at some laws which were glaringly immoral, in 17th century England, it was against the law for a Catholic to practice medicine or be a lawyer. Again, the law in 17th century England made Catholics ineligible to be doctors or lawyers. The law in England at this time also banned Catholic religious services, so that if a priest, for example, was celebrating the Catholic Mass in 17th century England, he was breaking the law and could be prosecuted, and indeed was prosecuted. At least 6 Catholic priests, historians tell us, were executed in 17th century England for breaking one of various laws which had made the Catholic religion and Catholic religious services illegal. Also, England, in the 17th century, since it was also ruling Ireland, outlawed the Catholic religion in Ireland. So again, in the 17th century, England had a host of laws which discriminated against Catholics living in that country. The government was, to say the obvious, very pro-Protestant. In France at this time, an opposite situation prevailed. In France, the Catholics were in control, and it was the Protestants who were discriminated against. In 18th century France, the law made Protestants ineligible to be doctors or lawyers. Again, the exact opposite situation of England, whereby Catholics could not become doctors or lawyers. Also, the law in 18th century France forbade any Protestant from holding public office, and Protestant religious services were forbidden. I raise the question, is the law always a reliable guide to what is moral? I think one can see by the many examples I just gave, and there are so many, many examples I didn't give, that the answer is no. The law is not always a reliable guide to what is moral. Indeed, some very famous thinkers have argued that at times people have an obligation to disobey certain laws, laws which are unjust and immoral. Perhaps the most famous essay ever written on this subject of disobedience to unfair laws was Henry David Thoreau's essay, Civil Disobedience, which he wrote in the first half of the 19th century. Thoreau deeply believed, that if a law was unjust, people had a moral obligation to disobey it. And he set the example. Thoreau, in the 1840s, went to jail for not paying his taxes. He deliberately refused to pay his taxes, so that, of course, he broke the tax laws. And why did Thoreau do this? Well, Thoreau did this during the Mexican War. The United States at the time was fighting a war with Mexico, and Thoreau, who was very anti-slavery, was convinced that the U.S. government was fighting this war to gain land from Mexico, and that it would then spread slavery into this newly acquired land. So that, in Thoreau's opinion, the Mexican War was a land grab on the part of the United States government. and therefore, again, he refused to support the war and refused to pay his taxes, which would go to support this war. Thoreau's idea was he was not going to pay taxes to a government which allowed 4 million people to live in slavery, and which might even increase the number of people living under slavery if it succeeded, again, in defeating Mexico and extending slavery, expanding slavery to other areas. In Thoreau's very famous essay on this subject, again, the essay is entitled Civil Disobedience, Thoreau said the following, and I'm quoting him: "It is not desirable to cultivate a respect for the law as much as for the right." Again, it is not desirable to cultivate a respect for the law so much as for the right. He went on to say, and I'm quoting him, "The only obligation I have a right to assume at any time is to do what I think is right." And again, you must remember, Thoreau was willing to go to jail for breaking the law. And as I said, he did go to jail. As it turned out, Thoreau spent only one night in jail. Why only one night for not paying his taxes? Well, what happened was someone paid his taxes for him. To this day, historians are not sure who it was. It might have been an aunt. Some people have speculated it was a relative. And some historians tell us that when Thoreau was told, after spending a night in jail, that he was free to go, that he insisted on not leaving jail, that he insisted that this was a protest against the law, and he wanted to stay in jail, and that he was quite upset that somebody had paid his taxes. And indeed, some historians claim that Thoreau became involved in a shoving match with the jailer trying to push Thoreau out of jail when Thoreau was insistent on staying in jail to make a point about how cruel slavery was and how unfair the Mexican War was. Another example of a famous person disobeying a law, indeed disobeying many laws, is the example of Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi, of course, lived in India. He is perhaps the most famous of all Indian people. And as you probably know, for about 200 years, until the 1940s, England ruled India. And it ruled India against the will of the Indian people. Gandhi claimed it was so unfair of England to come into India's house, that's how he described the country of India, the house of India, and to rule it without getting the consent of the Indian people. In any event, the British passed all kinds of laws since they were ruling India, and of course the Indians were obliged to obey them. One of the most repugnant of these laws, as Gandhi saw it, was the salt law. England had a law which said, in effect, that all Indians had to buy their salt from the British. Again, the British were ruling India. In other words, the British had a monopoly on the sale of salt in India. And of course, salt is especially important in a country like India, which has a very hot climate. Gandhi decided he was going to disobey this law because he believed it was so unjust that the British again should have a monopoly on the sale of salt in India. So he organized what has been called the Salt March to the Sea. And Gandhi and hundreds of his followers eventually marched more than 200 miles to the sea. And when Gandhi got to the ocean, the Indian Ocean, there were many photographers and journalists on the beach to photograph what he was going to do. Gandhi picked up some salt that had been deposited by the ocean water on the surf, and then proceeded to sell this salt to somebody. And of course, in doing this, he was breaking the law, and eventually he was imprisoned. Indeed, Gandhi spent between 6 and 7 years in prison at various times, a total of between 6 and 7 years, for violating various British laws. Another famous example of a famous man breaking laws he considered to be immoral is the example of Martin Luther King Jr. You will recall that when Martin Luther King Jr. was leading his protests in the 1950s and the 1960s, he protested against racial segregation laws. Laws which segregated blacks from whites in luncheonettes, restaurants, schools, churches, etc., beaches, parks. And you might recall seeing newsreel of Martin Luther King Jr. sitting on a stool in a white luncheonette and ordering breakfast or lunch. And of course, he was breaking the law. The idea was that certain luncheonettes in the South were for white people and others were for black people. Well, when King was asked to leave by the white proprietor of the luncheonette, he refused to leave. He and his supporters refused to leave. And of course, King and his supporters were arrested, and King, like Gandhi and Thoreau, was placed in jail. Another example of a famous person who broke unfair laws, or I think what most people would consider to be unfair laws, is Nelson Mandela. Mandela was living in South Africa. South Africa had a system of apartheid, a system whereby a small group of white people ruled a country inhabited mostly by black people and set up a series of laws discriminating against black people, making it illegal for black people even to protest peacefully. That's right. When Nelson Mandela was breaking what he considered to be unfair laws in South Africa, the white government of South Africa had a law making it illegal to even peacefully protest anything, and therefore many blacks were imprisoned for peacefully protesting. Well, what did these famous lawbreakers accomplish? Well, Gandhi eventually accomplished his main goal, which was to drive the British out of India. Remember, they had ruled India for approximately 200 years. And in the late 1940s, the British, who were made to feel increasingly uncomfortable by Gandhi and his supporters, decided to leave and granted India its independence. And what did Martin Luther King Jr. and Nelson Mandela accomplish? Well, because of them, many laws, unfair laws, were abolished. Others were changed. So as a result of Martin Luther King Jr.'s efforts and Nelson Mandela's efforts, the United States and South Africa, respectively, became much more just societies. Indeed, Mandela achieved a peaceful revolution whereby whereby the government of South Africa, which had been controlled by whites, was changed so that today it is mostly black people who control the government of South Africa. And as I mentioned, South Africa is inhabited mostly by black people. My recollection is about 80% of the people who live in South Africa are black. Although I must add, there are white people in the government of South Africa today. And indeed, Mandela became the first president of the mostly black government of South Africa, and proceeded to engage in a process of reconciliation with whites, so that the present government of South Africa has gone out of its way not to discriminate against white people. And that's quite interesting, since again the previous white government had discriminated against black people. Some important questions. If Gandhi, King, Mandela, Thoreau had not undertaken to break the laws they believed were unjust and immoral, would their countries be less just, less moral places today? Martin Luther King Jr. believed that God's law, and he was a minister, by the way, King believed that God's law is superior to man-made law, and that when man-made law violates God's law, people have a moral obligation to disobey those laws. What do you think? And another question, and this goes to the heart of the matter: is it ever right to disobey a law one thinks is immoral? What do you think? Is it ever right to disobey a law one thinks is immoral? And one final question here: should a person be sent to jail for breaking a law he or she can plausibly argue to be immoral? Again, what do you think? As usual, I'd like to conclude with a quotation from Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau, in his masterpiece entitled Walden, claimed that we are all artists. He penned the following words: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."